Hey guys, welcome back to the Questioning Behavior podcast. We're glad to have you back. I am once more here with Sarah, my co-host.
Hi.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't believe in
So,
science.
today we're actually going to talk about applying behavioral science to your own life. So, to kick us off, Sarah, do you apply behavioral science to your own life at all?
I guess I must do. Maybe not very well, but I think it's one of these things where what I've learned through doing this podcast is that everyone is a behavioral scientist, whether they know it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I know that I'm a behavioral scientist, maybe I'm... yeah, I don't know. I must do, but probably not very well, is probably my answer. What about you? Can you think of any good examples?
Out of my own life, I feel like I apply quite a bit of behavioral science, but it's mainly in the how to fix your own finances, how to not fall into temptation, where not to look when in the grocery store, don't go shopping hungry. If you don't want to eat bad food, don't buy bad food. You know, it's all that type of stuff. And I'm massively into how to grow your sense of discipline, how to adjust your reward system to that, stuff like that. So that's very, very behavioral sciencey, I suppose. But my main wheelhouse is still personal finance. So everything behavioral science and personal finance is applied to my own life, to the surprise and disgust of many around me.
Oh, I don't think that's true. I mean, it sounds like a lot of the behavioral type problems you apply behavioral science to try and solve are self-control problems.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
that is my main game. My main game is
the main
that.
game. The main thing that lots of people deal with, I think, and it's an easy one, I think, for behavioral science to say something about.
Oh, for sure.
It's one of these curious things where self-control problems are a sort of a low-hanging fruit, I guess, for behavioral science. But what's interesting is how behavioral science can help beyond these applications. And, I'm interested to find out more. I'm not sure about you.
I am very, very interested in finding out more and how behavioral science can be applied to your own life, which is exactly why we invited the guest that we're speaking to today to be on the podcast. So we're going to be talking to David Perrott. So let's move into that. All right, so today we are talking to David, and obviously, as goes with these specific podcasts, David, tell the audience who you are.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on. So yeah, my name's David Perrott. I live in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm an applied behavioral scientist. That's how I think about myself, a behavioral science practitioner. And my focus is really on two things at the moment. The one is working in a consulting capacity. So I work with governments and companies, mostly in the financial services sector, to help them apply behavioral science to the way that they design policies and products. And then besides that, I also have a program called Circles of Time, which looks at, I think, this really new and exciting area of behavioral science, which I'm calling self-applied behavioral science, which is basically the idea of how you can take the toolbox that has been, crafted and created over the last decade and think about how those tools might be used by individuals, by citizens, so that they can shape their own behavior, build habits, redesign their contexts in ways that might lead them to be happier, healthier, and wealthier. And so that's been running now for the past, just coming up to around a year. And going well so far.
Yeah, sounds super interesting. I'm really interested to hear about circles in time. What type of problems or sort of self-diagnosed problems would you say the program is really good for? Is it mostly sort of self-control issues or does it go a bit beyond that?
Yeah, that's been an interesting thing because when I set it up, I left it quite open-ended in terms of the particular behaviors that the participants were going to take on. I didn't constrain it to health or finance or productivity. I just went through this process of identifying or helping individuals to identify what their problems were and then turn those into behavior-based goals. And what was interesting was it's just been, as I've moved through different cohorts of the program, how different behaviors have surfaced. So, for example, I did the second variation of the program during COVID, and there was a lot of focus on health. There was a lot of interest in things like getting more sleep or exercising more, doing body work. And so I think it's interesting just to see how the culture or the trends that are, sort of present influence those particular behaviors. Whereas the third cohort that I've just finished now, their focus has been much more on productivity, getting back into good work routines, deep focus, planning, getting systems up and running around planning. So that's been, it's been an interesting learning. But in terms of, a more general lens, would be that the focus is really on closing intention action gaps, right? So identifying a particular behavior that people are interested in doing, interested in creating a routine or a habit around, but they just struggle to really get that up and running. So it has to be circular. It's not once-off behaviors. So it's got to be this kind of ongoing activity. And it must be something that either people are trying to start, stop, or dial up the frequency of. So that's it in a nutshell. It's an 8-week program at the moment. So it goes through this process of identifying that behavior, designing a system, and then the really interesting part for me is around self-experimentation, right? So how can you set that up in a way where you're not just relying on your intuition to figure out if it's something that's working for you, but actually tracking your progress, looking at the flow-on effects or the externalities, the other aspects of your life that it might be this new behavior might be affecting. And at the end of the program, making a decision around whether it's a system and a behavior that's serving you, that's actually helping you. And then if it is, integrating it more formally or seriously into your everyday life.
Well, that's so interesting. Unlocking the behavioral scientist in everyone. I guess there's a little one, innate behavioral scientist in us all. So
that's the vision.
That's
the vision.
Yeah.
So I am, in that case, quite curious why this specific application of behavioral science. Why only apply to the individual? What is it that that really interests you about this application of behavioral science?
Oh, that's a good question, Merle. A good question, and you've done some prep to ask me that. So I've been on a journey over the last year or so. So for 6 years, I co-founded a consultancy in 2013 called Gravity Ideas that really looked at how we could take learnings and insights from applied behavioral science and apply that within a corporate space and government space. And about a year ago, I stepped back from that, and my interest was really around looking at behavioral science as a field or a market in itself, and how I could help grow and form that, right? As opposed to being just a agent or player within the space, what I could do to actually build the industry and grow it, and make sure it's something that stays around for the long run. And going through that process, I made the observation that although there's been a lot of focus over the past decade on adoption, so building a value proposition for behavioral science, getting companies and governments to create units or bake it into their products or the way that they were doing service or product design. There's a lot of this adoption, but in terms of the frameworks and tools and the ways that we approach projects and problems, that hasn't changed much in the last decade. We still rely on the same frameworks, models, things like EAST or COMBI or things like even more Mindspace.
ISM.
There we go. Yeah, the list. The list goes on, exactly. But but for me, they're all, if you look at them and the fundamentals under which they rely, there's lots of similarities, and it feels like that kind of framework or model has been exhausted. There isn't much iteration there. And so I started looking out for other areas in which there may be opportunities to grow the field. Where the next innovation is going to come from? Where's the next Mindspace or East going to come from? And in doing that, what I realized was that there are a set of limitations or constraints that are really holding the field back, and that we have to think very seriously about if we want to overcome them. And they largely boil down to this tension between the ethics of the field. So being able to distribute or create or deploy behavioral science in an ethical manner to the individual, and this movement towards heterogeneity or accommodating or tailoring nudges or interventions to individuals' unique persuasion profiles, for lack of a better term, or unique choice architecture profiles, right? So moving away from this one-size-fits-all approach towards a more tailored approach. But with that, realizing that we need to be gathering more data around the individual, we need to be figuring out what motivates them in particular contexts. We need to be understanding the cultural dynamics and how these interventions may vary across different social environments, and that tension between the ethics and becoming more nuanced and more effective was really one of the reasons, I think, for me, that I believe has kind of held back innovation a bit, and for me, the only way that I thought to kind of figure it out or resolve that problem was to move away from a more centralized approach to a slightly more decentralized approach, right? So as opposed to deploying policy that's informed by behavioral science as a government level, moving to a local government level, or moving to a company level, or moving to a community level. And if you move through that process all the way to the end, you get to the individual. And so I asked myself the question, how could I take these tools and provide them to the individual? They know their context and they know their environments and their preferences better than any third party ever could. And so how could I use that to get people to change their own behavior in interesting and helpful ways? So I think that's a bit of the logic as to how I got to this experiment that I'm now working on. And it very much is an experiment. It's one of those things that I've set up. I'm exploring. I'm going to see if it works, and if it doesn't, I'll pivot and try something else. But I think that's what we need in the field. We need people who are pushing the adoption, of the tools that have worked, the behavioral design processes created by Ideas 42 and JPAL, the frameworks created by BIT, East, and Basic, and those sorts of things. We need people to really promote the value proposition of those. But we also need individuals who are on the edge, innovating, coming up with new ways to apply behavioral science, new models, new tools, just so that the field is continuously expanding and we're not getting to a kind of a local maximum or a point of stability or stasis.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. So, I mean, you say you're sort of running this as an experiment, but do you mean that in the sort of scientific sense as well? Like, are you collecting data on, for who were the behavioral toolkits successful? Is this sort of data you're collecting? Is there any sort of early insights that you could share? So anything that maybe surprised you, something you expected to work for a lot of people that actually getting feedback straight from the individuals, it seems as though it's maybe not as helpful as they originally thought? Yeah.
You guys are such great questions. So,
thanks.
So yeah, it very much is an experiment. So I have an impact assessment that I'm doing, and that that I give to the participants, where I basically look at a baseline around the particular behavior that they want to change or want to take up or reduce, if it's something like sugar, for example, where they're trying to reduce their intake. So whatever that behavior is, identifying a baseline and then looking at, based on once they've implemented their system, put that system in place, how their behavior has changed over the course of 4 weeks. And of course, that's still a short period. I'd love to see it over longer periods. But in terms of those 4 weeks, just getting a kind of basic comparison of whether the program has been effective or not, and so that's at a kind of quantitative layer. But then at a qualitative layer too, I have these weekly check-ins. I'm gathering data and feedback on how their systems are going, what's working, what's not, and you see kind of typical patterns like week 2 or 3. The novelty and excitement of the new behavior wears off and people start slipping a bit. And I think that's where the system becomes really valuable. And I think what surprised me is there's been this interesting byproduct, which is around self-awareness, which, I had a bit of a hypothesis going in that this would be something important, but I really didn't know how to communicate it effectively. But it's something that's continuously coming up from participants, that by focusing very specifically for a prolonged period of time on one behavior and the context and the system around that, they are gaining interesting insights into their own psychology, into what motivates them, into what environmental factors influence them. And what they're doing then is extracting out sort of generalizable rules or principles that they then apply to new behaviors that they take on, right? So someone who's put in place a morning meditation habit or your sort of routine is taking learnings around how that works and what works for them in a particular context and applying that to getting into a system of exercising, for example. So that's been an interesting kind of value add that seems like it's something unique, and that's not the sort of thing you would get from a third party perspective, because the individual isn't learning from their behavior change. They're just getting shaped by the choice architecture of a website or a public environment. Whereas this approach is really it's growing or improving the person's ability to shape or influence themselves in interesting ways. That's the thing that surprised me a bit, and and interesting to explore and think more deeply about.
Yeah, you're teaching people how to fish, so then they can eat for the rest of the year rather than giving them a fish and they can eat for a day. It's a sort of metaphor,
a lovely way
right?
to put it. Yeah, absolutely. That's nice.
I have a question with regards to, so I'm a bit of a devil's advocate. Normally Sarah is, but I'll play the part this time. So
Thank you.
You're so welcome. When I think of picking up a new behavior or focusing my energy and my attention towards, improving myself on one domain, I've done this a couple of times. I do like to apply behavioral science to myself, as I think everyone should, especially if you're in behavioral science. But what I always notice is that if like I said, redirecting my attention or focusing it differently, is that other areas of my life start slipping. So for me to build new habits means that they they cost me in other areas of my life. Is that something that you've noticed with your own, what do I call them? Participants? It seems a bit too experimental.
Consumers.
Consumer sounds even worse.
Yeah.
Let's call them human beings. So
that's a good one.
Yeah, but then I'm calling them your human beings, which to some extent, it has a historical connotation that I just want to avoid.
That's fair. Okay. Well, besides what we call them, it has been an interesting observation. So what I realized was that people would build up this confidence because they put the system in place and it was going really well. And so they would then set up a second behavior-based goal and then a third one. And the individuals that did that crashed very quickly. They would go back to zero. Literally,
yeah, I relate.
So it became an important sort of observational learning, was that really just focusing on that one very specific behavior. And even if you're feeling confident, if you feel like that system's in place, just sort of moving you sort of with it, persisting with it for at least a month before you pick up another system. And then also what I've tried to get individuals to do is to track the externalities. So track the other dimensions of your health, so that you're getting this more holistic picture of the effect that it's having on your life. So I use a kind of counterfactual. So imagine a scenario where, Merle is performing this new behavior-based goal versus one where she isn't, and what are all the differences to her life that might have changed or been adapted as a result of doing this effectively over time. And then quite analytically or systematically making a decision at the end of those 4 weeks as to whether it's working for you, not just from the perspective of it being enjoyable or being fulfilling, but actually more generally, what kind of effect is it having on your life? And is that net positive or negative? And if it's net negative, then looking at iterating or maybe lightening the load. So as opposed to doing an intense piece of exercise for 2 hours, dialing that back to half an hour. You know what I mean? So really looking at that a bit more systematically. So that's the one thing I'd say. The other part is, how do I put this? Is just around kind of early stage drop off or iteration. So as opposed to, so when I first set up the program, what I did was I said, once you've created the plan, commit to it for 4 weeks and don't change anything. In a very kind of experimental format.
Sure.
So try and keep it as controlled as possible. And what I've realized is that actually implementing it and giving people a sandpit to play with, so playing with different variations of your behavior for the first week, proved to be really helpful. So trying to use that as part of the creation process, as opposed to just committing to something that you've come up with your head and come up theoretically with, and now just putting into play. So giving people that space to iterate has been really helpful, because then they can get a feel for what works and what doesn't. And you quickly realize if it's having negative effects on other areas of your life within that first week of actually practicing it. So giving a little bit of flexibility in the early stages has helped to mitigate some of that, negative externalities or flow-on effects that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up the sort of interesting debate that's been going on relatively recently about the ethics of behavioral science, and I guess sort of put yourself on the sort of position where maybe too much discussion of ethics has stifled some of the innovation or possible ways that the field can innovate and progress. But do you think that there is a real problem with the way that behavioral science is or could potentially be used? And how does, I guess, your model sort of help answer the ethics question of not having to compromise, necessary innovation for ethics?
Yeah, great question. So I think about it in two ways. The one is at the level of behavior. So our ability to know whether the behavior that we're trying to get citizens or customers or users to do is actually in their interests, right? So there are obvious examples, things like getting people to pay their tax returns on time. That seems like it's one of those behaviors that's it's good for society, it's good for the individual. It's quite clear, that that's a behavior that we can be confident that we want to change for the better. But then there are other things like, to jump into Merle's wheelhouse, something like, getting people to use more cash or getting people to take on, digital payment systems. That's one of those areas where it's not that clear what the right direction to go in is, right? So there are pros and cons to both places, and so creating policy around that is difficult. It'd be better to know the individual's particular preferences, but then getting at those preferences is so difficult. And then also those preferences aren't static, right? It might be the case that person starts using digital payments and they're really excited about how efficient it is, but then they realize, holy shit, I'm spending so much more money than I should have because it's so easy, and then they want to jump back to using cash in particular contexts. Modeling that and trying to predict those kinds of preferences is just a really difficult thing. And so I think there's an important ethical conversation there just around people's intentions and whether the behaviors that we're trying to change are actually in their best interest, and are we aligned with that. And then the second area is just around the interventions themselves, right? So so for example, if we go back to that tax example, one of the famous studies that BIT did, early on, that really kind of really pushed the field forward was around their tax returns and timing, and their use of social norms as a way to do that, right? So they tried different messages, and they found that if you said that people in your neighborhood with similar kinds of tax returns, outstanding to you, had paid on time, you were more likely to. And so that was a really effective intervention, and it got people to change their behavior. But there might have been negative externalities that emerged out of that. Like, how did that affect people's psychological well-being? Right? Did it create stresses? Did they feel anxious about the fact that there were other people in their neighborhood that were performing behavior differently to them? So thinking about how the interventions themselves affect people, I think is important too. And so
I can just imagine with this specific intervention, because Sarah's super competitive, right? So Sarah would want to outperform anyone in the neighborhood, meaning that Sarah would be sitting there days on end in the dark, having everything unplugged, which is not entirely the point of the intervention, but that is exactly what Sarah would be doing.
Exactly.
If we focus on the outcomes and not, we miss a lot of information. Lots of people can reach the same outcome by taking very different actions or having very different experiences. So it's interesting what you're saying about taking into account welfare and, trying to think that maybe more than the outcome is really what matters. And I guess that leads into another question that I have, unless Merle, do you want to
No, go
jump
for it.
in? Okay. Actually, that's got two questions. I need to choose.
You can ask both.
Okay, I'll pick one. Is behavior always the goal in your experience? Is there any, examples or any situations where maybe behavior change isn't what we want or what we need? And I guess when we're closing intention action gaps, behavior is a really nice, in most situations, measurable, observable thing, tangible thing. I'm just sort of interested in your opinion. Is it ever the case that behavior change is not the goal in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. Absolutely. I mean, it's just so behavior is it's always approximate for something else, right? If we're trying to get people to run more, the purpose isn't the running itself. It's because we improve their health. If we're trying to get people to have more conversations or be more productive at work, whatever those behaviors are, the assumption is that there's a direct sort of relation or sort of causal relation with some other factor that's more important, that's more distal. So you're right. It's never an end in itself. It's just the best way that we know to measurably have an effect on those higher order goals or functions that are important to individuals and to society. So yeah, it's always approximate. It just happens to be quite measurable, and it also happens to be the thing that often does a lot of work in moving the needle on that higher level goal or function.
Good answer.
Yeah, it's a great answer. But from that answer onward, so obviously you've already mentioned that within your own program, also within your own vision, that the aim is to change longer term behavior or to help people achieve longer term goals. So my question then kind of is, with the tools that we currently have and the research that we currently have, is that something that can actually be properly done?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and you're right. There's been a lot of focus on behavior change and what are the most effective ways to change behavior, and less focus on whether that behavior is actually, serving us over the long run. And it's a difficult thing to study because we're always looking at proximates. There are only a few, longitudinal studies that are out there that, and most of them are in the health space, right? They're looking at our physiology and our health span and our mortality and those sorts of things. And so I think there's going to be progress there, but it requires, I think, more a cross-field collaboration, sort of working at the intersections between fields like biology and neuroscience and behavioral science, and really mapping the causal relations between the effects that behaviors are having and the outcomes or the effects on our mental health, on our physical health. And so, I mean, personally, the way I see it is my philosophy is all around this idea of optionality, and I see health as a vehicle for continuously expanding optionality. I'm a big believer in, so the work in philosophy around transformative experiences and how our preferences might be different on the other side of a transformative experience. And then also, some of Dan Gilbert's work around thinking about the future self and how we often underestimate how much we change over time, right? Largely due to just our inability to imagine ourselves with different preferences and desires and values. But then when we look back with hindsight, we see that we've actually changed quite a lot. And so taking on that observation and using it to think about how you should go about shaping, what behaviors you take up now, in order to put yourself in the best position to be happy in the future, that's an important question that I kind of ask myself. And for me, the answer to that is just a continuously expanding optionality, and then using health as a vehicle to create that optionality, but health being a very general frame as opposed to specifically focused on physiology, thinking about mental health and cognition and cognitive flexibility and neuroplasticity, thinking about financial health in terms of continuously increasing levels of freedom, thinking about relational health in terms of our sort of social relationships and dynamics in your community, and other areas. So taking that kind of general view of health and then identifying what are the particular behaviors that I can put in place today that improve those different dimensions of health in a manner that they expand my optionality continuously, so that I can act on whatever makes me happy in the short term over the long run, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Sure. It makes a lot of sense, but then I suppose, how is this in a more practical sense of the word? How are you applying this to your own life? Like, what are the actual practical steps that you're taking to ensure that this actually happens?
Yeah. So it's a very kind of top-down, bottom-up approach, right? So I'm asking myself, what are the things that expand my optionality? And then what I've done is identify 6 dimensions of health. So, for example, those ones I mentioned: physical health, mental health, relational health, and then look to the literature or the science around particular activities that have been proven that there's some evidence behind increasing along those different dimensions of health, right? So we know, for example, that things like meditation or gratitude journaling or making sure that you engage frequently with friends and have strong relational bonds are really good for that mental health dimension. So then going from there, from those ambiguous sorts of goals down to very particular behaviors that I can then ritualize or turn into routines that I perform on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis.
It almost sounds like you take the third person view of your own life a little bit. I don't know if that makes sense. Like you're playing in third person. That you've got that sort of introspection and that's not a word, but I'm going to say extrospection of like looking inwards and outwards in a way that you're sort of not operating like a normal human being. But is it working? Do you feel your life has improved for it? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's an interesting way to put it. I mean, I think about it as just having as always being the sort of observer and the subject, or the experimenter and the participants, and really living that. So yeah, I think I do. I try to create spaces in my life to step back and review and reflect, and I have systems in place in order to do that. So I'm kind of doing a daily journal, which I then reflect on weekly, which I then reflect on those weekly reflections monthly, and then do that on a quarterly and annual basis. So creating time and space to actually step back and look at your life and what's working and what's not, I think is an incredibly valuable exercise that I've had some experience with now for the past few years that I've been doing it, and really seeing the benefits of it for sure. I think that's the one side. I think the other side is you just learn to take yourself a little less seriously, and you become a bit more playful with the way that you engage with the world, because of that slight detachment and seeing yourself as a bit of a player in a computer game, as opposed to being completely identified with your thoughts and your emotions. And I suppose perhaps sort of meditation and mindfulness and sort of exploring that area, or that side of my life, has also been complementary, in this philosophy too.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for letting us inside your weird and wonderful brain for the last hour. I think we could probably spend hours and hours asking you questions and just unraveling more and more sort of your process and your view on behavioral science. But yeah, just to say thank you so much for your time today. And if the listener wants to continue getting some more insights in the way that your mind works, where can they find you online?
Yeah, thanks, guys. I really enjoyed this, and thank you for the great questions. Really, really great questions, and
you're
also
very welcome.
And your patience with my technical difficulties.
Oh well.
In terms of getting in touch with me, I think the best place would either be via Twitter, just at David Perrott 1_, or via. I've got a Substack newsletter that I am pushing out on a weekly basis, and that's got all the details around my Circles in Time program. And I'm continuously sort of sharing updates there and trying to make my learning journey with this program really transparent and public, and really trying to work in public as one of my one of my big objectives for this whole program. So I think that would probably be the best place to get in touch with me if you are interested in joining that community or that program.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, David, thanks so much for making the time. Thanks for letting us pick your brain. And I hope... So this is something we haven't actually mentioned, but David has actually started his own podcast as well, which is called Sample of One, which we'll also make sure to leave the details of that below in the description box, or whatever that thing is called, because then David interviews people. He has interviewed me as well, I have to mention.
Oh, yeah.
But
Disclaimer.
Disclaimer. He's interviewed more interesting people as well, so don't worry. But he talks more about how people, what field they're in and how they apply that own field to themselves, and how people could apply the insights from that specific field to themselves as well. So much more insight into how you can apply different areas of behavioral science to yourself. And I think if there's one thing we have learned from this episode, I suppose it is that we should apply behavioral science to ourselves. So thank you so much, David.
Absolutely. Thanks for that pun, Merle. Appreciate that.
Yeah, good stuff.
All right, so that was us talking to David about how you can apply behavioral science to your own life. I feel like I've learned a lot. I think it's really interesting that we talked about, the fact that you really do have to tackle your challenges and apply behavioral science to them one challenge at a time, because otherwise the card house does actually collapse and you lose motivation and it all just kind of goes to shit. Sarah, do you think that is how you would approach it? Because you're a go hard or go home kind of person. So how would you do this?
I think it's definitely good advice, and I think what we heard consistently, I guess, from David was a lot of good advice, which is really valuable. So things like just reframing the problem or reframing your goals into something that is actually achievable can have such a big impact on whether or not you stick with something. And I do feel empathy, because I'm also this type of person that I get this sort of new goal or this new thing in my life, and I'm super excited about it. And
oh yeah, you get obsessive.
yeah, and I feel super good about myself, like really, really going hard at this. But it's not sustainable in the long run if you also have other things in your life that you either need to do or other commitments. So I definitely, I think that there's so much power in reframing things and changing your perspective on something. And it's just trying to figure out exactly which type of framing is going to be best for you. And I think that's a lot of what we heard, I guess, with David and his work. It's all about working with individuals at that individual level to sort of unlock what is going to work for you in this context, and sort of giving people the power to be their own behavioral scientist in a way, their own behavioral science consultant.
No, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned context, and that David was so keen on mentioning it as well, because I feel like if we look at, obviously for our point of view, academic research, I feel like when we look into behavioral change and the type of nudging or the models or theories that seem to be applied there, they seem to be very focused on being this one-time hit wonder, like a thing worked once, which of course is valid in and of itself, but very rarely do we see research that goes much beyond that, at least on an academic sense, or like a peer-reviewed journal published sense, where we can actually just have a longer a study that's longer on a temporal horizon. I'm not entirely sure where I was going with it. It's just a long duration study, where we can see that this was actually continuously integrated into someone's life. Because I feel to some extent, if you can't integrate it into your life, into your current context, or it was a one-time wonder, but in a longer term, it would cost you, or it would be at the expense of other things, in your life, other goals that you might hold. Be them financial, health-wise, social, it doesn't really matter. But if one goal is in direct conflict with the other, it's going to be quite problematic. And I feel like there's not that much research or that much push towards that yet, which I think is very interesting that David already mentioned, and that he's very much looking into this. And it's a very much a one goal at a time approach. With the focus on integrating that goal into the life that you currently have and the context that you're currently in. So I think it's really cool stuff.
Yeah, and I think your point about the sort of the types of studies that we see in these academic journals is a really good one. And I think that there are lots of reasons why, like structural reasons, why it's so much less common to see a study that looks at behavior and tracks behavior over the long term, not only because it's more complicated and having access to that data is much more time and money intensive, but also in terms of the timelines of journals. Like, I know, in economics, you could be trying to get a paper published for years. And so the sort of the structures within academia have led us to this type of research, I would say. So that's almost why I think it's super important that we also have behavioral science happening and behavioral science innovation occurring. And I guess innovation really is the word that, or innovative is the word that I would associate with David after this interview, in sort of developing it and building knowledge at this individual tailored level. And I guess the thing about goal setting, it's about whose goal or what is the goal of the behavior change, who's setting the sort of optimal behavior or the intended behavior.
It's a lot less paternalistic than general behavioral science when used in policy, which is quite frankly why I like this much more. I mean, I'm not a very paternalistic person, even liberal paternalism, I'm a bit like, because I don't agree with all the types of goals they want to achieve. But I mean, if it's you and you know your life, you know your context, and you know where you want to go, and it's just a matter of how, in that case, I'm all for it. I think this is maybe one of the best uses of behavioral science because it's directly towards self-improvement. And I think that's the best way you can use it.
And I think it's an interesting in terms of the ethics conversation as well, because it does solve a lot of the big issues that people and important issues that people have brought up about behavioral science and the paternalism, I mean, what you end up having, I guess, in David's world is a lot of sophisticated agents who are at least aware on some level that they would like to be making a change, and that's not everyone. Not everyone is a sophisticated agent, and also people who have the time and ability to and the resources to seek help. So I think while it does solve the ethical problem, there is I still think there is a place for behavioral science to be used obviously in other aspects where it could benefit or could help people who are not so sophisticated or don't have so many access to resources, whether that's time or money, to make these improvements in their lives. But so that's why I think we need both.
Sure.
But there is still very important questions and discussions to be had about the ethics and the paternalism within behavioral science. I think it's very, very interesting.
Absolutely. I think that's a great note to end on, a very nice and thought-provoking note. So guys, this was it for this week. Let us know on social media what you thought of this episode, whether you agree with Sarah's view on paternalism and ethics, and whether we do need to have more discussion. And if so, please do discuss. And everything about David, all his links, as always, will be linked below. And we hope to see you for the next episode.
Yeah. Also, you should check out Merle on David's podcast. She's excellent. Excellent.
That will also be linked below. Thanks for the plug, Sarah. See you next week, guys.
Bye.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love